explosive anger, or emotional blackmail. At this point, the relationship with Jung becomes more intense because the anxious person projects salvation onto you rather than just a symbolic figure. When you leave, you don't just let them down. You destroy the illusion of security. The collapse isn't about what happened between you, rather it's about what the other person was unable to create within themselves, a sense of internal security. Margaret Mahler offers a crucial explanation of this suffering because for many, leaving is a trauma rather than just a loss. The psychologist and psychoanalyst Margaret Mahler dedicated her life to understanding how a human being truly becomes an individual. And what she discovered is as disturbing as it is revealing that many adults we see today who are emotionally dependent, disorganized in the face of separation, or desperate in the face of another's autonomy, are actually children who never completed the separation individuation process for themselves. This psychic cut dates back to early childhood, a rupture that activates wounds so primitive that the other can hardly name what they feel. Mahler, psychological birth does not happen at the same time as biological birth. One thing is leaving the womb, and the other is emerging from the symbiotic fusion with the maternal figure, whether that figure is the mother, a caregiver, or later, an emotional partner. In the first few months of life, the child does not see itself as a separate being. Instead, they live in a state of symbiosis, where the mother's presence is the continuity of the child's own existence. This state of fusion is normal at birth, but it must be gradually broken in order for the development of individuality, emotional autonomy, and the ability to be alone. The problem is that early traumas often prevent this breaking from happening. As it should. You become a part of someone's identity when you become the symbiotic other for someone who has never emotionally differentiated. You are the ground, the outline, the psychic extension. When you choose to distance yourself, whether because you are tired of the relationship or simply realize it has become toxic, you are not just walking away. You are forcing a psychic birth. You are tearing the other away from a primitive illusion of unity. You are saying we are not one, and this is intolerable for someone who lives in a symbiotic identity. This process can be hampered or distorted by insecure bonds, erratic caretakers, and childhood integration issues. The person panics because they feel mentally torn apart by your absence, not because they genuinely love you. This was what Mahler called forced birth. It is the symbiotic child's cry of childhood sorrow echoing in an adult body. Don't leave me alone. I don't know who I am without you. When you finally distance yourself and break this symbiotic bond, what also breaks is the illusion of control that the other exerted over you, and in the face of collapse, the reaction is born manipulation. This is precisely why the intensity of the pain stems from the intensity of the fusion. The more fused the other was to you, the more brutal the impact of your absence will be. Attempts at restoration at any costs through rage blackmail the fundamental delusion that the other person is our property and owes us something is present in every symbiotic relationship. Unwavering devotion on an emotional level. However, this illusion of belonging is actually an unconscious attempt at control, and it is this unseen system of control that starts to fall apart when you start to distance yourself, create limits, and say no. People who depend on others to maintain an image of emotional stability and who are characterized by neurotic attachment or symbiotic relationships frequently lack the ability to control their emotions. When the other person chooses to vary from the script, they break the predictability and seek out their individuality. Because the gesture is interpreted by these people's psyche as betrayal, abandonment, or destruction, the reaction to your autonomy often appears out of proportion. In this instance, a dangerous pattern indicates the need to restore power at any costs. Your absence is not viewed as your right, but rather as a personal attack, as if you are intentionally creating suffering by removing yourself. This might happen right away through demands and accusations, emotional blackmail, or more covertly, manipulative silences, deliberate victimization. Moral inversions happen when you are accused of selfishness for wanting to protect oneself. The anger that follows is not about you, but rather what you represent, the violation of an unspoken mental contract and the belief that you would always be there. Constant that is accessible. Carl Jung warns us that when power rules a relationship, love is lacking and freedom is replaced by power, which transforms compassion into manipulation and love into a tool of control. Instead of bringing two whole people together, the bond turns into an emotional prison where only one person can breathe at a time. In essence, this type of connection is emotional colonization. The other person is more concerned with what you accomplish for them in the symbolic space you occupy than with your identity. Your autonomy will be seen as a threat rather than as evolution, since, despite your usefulness and predictability, you now become dangerous because you have chosen freedom and are conscious that you wish to go, just like any colony that decides to liberate itself. At this point, a lot of people turn around because they feel bad about letting their own misery be taken over by the suffering of others. Independence to prevent hurting anyone else. But it's crucial to realize that the other person is hurt not by you, but rather by the loss of control. They are hurt because they don't know who they are without you acting as an emotional support system, and you can't keep absolving yourself in order to maintain a structure that should be the other person's responsibility. In the following section, we'll go deeper into this reality. We will discuss the emptiness, the existential hole that appears when the mirror goes away, and why, deep down, this collapse was never about you. If what you're hearing speaks to you, you'll find genuine value in my ebook. Your absence does not cause pain because you were loved, but rather because you endured what the other did not want to face. Beyond the Shadow dissects Jung's core concepts and provides you with the means to gain a deeper understanding of yourself. There comes a time when you have to confront one of the most freeing and agonizing realities about some relationships. The issue was never you. The severity of the other person's suffering, no matter how genuine it may seem, is a reflection of the depth of dependency rather than the depth of love, and this is an important distinction. When you decide to grow up and leave to breathe, dependency screams because true love respects uniqueness, cycles, understanding, and limits dependency. On the other hand, it wants possession, continuity, and that the other never changes. Many become confused at this stage, since it blames, begs, and manipulates you in an attempt to return you to the location of borrowed stability. When you distance yourself, the pain of the other person can be so great and dramatic that you begin to question whether you were too cruel, selfish, or insensitive. But that guilt is not yours. Rather, it was created by the distortion of a bond that was initially based on the other person's need rather than your truth. Your freedom is not cruel. It is a right, and it is frequently also an act of self-love. When someone breaks down because you left, what emerges is the void you occupied, an internal space that the other person never learned to fill on their own. You were not loved for who you were, but rather for what you stood for. You were the seditious, the solid ground. Your departure reveals what has always been there, but hidden chronic insecurity, fear of loneliness, psychic helplessness, and sometimes it is only after you leave that the other person realizes how much they have lost themselves and how much they expected you to fill it. This does not imply that you are to blame for that void. Rather, it simply means you can no longer sacrifice yourself to fill it. The collapse the other person experiences after losing you is not just an emotional crisis, it is a revelation, a painful and raw chance to look inward and finally see themselves without projections. Therefore, no relationship is fair when it requires you to deny your individuality in order to keep the other emotionally whole. It is a zero-sum game where either you nullify yourself or the other reorganizes, and reorganizing hurts. But it is necessary. If the other person has the courage to face that mirror, it may be the beginning of their true maturation process, if they have the courage to do so. In the following section, we'll talk about Jung's theory of individuation and why emotional freedom is not a luxury, but rather a necessary step toward becoming who you really are. However, freedom comes at a high cost, because when you decide to become whole, you start to say, "I am not what you need me to be," and you withdraw from relationships that keep you in symbolic roles. One of the bravest things a person can do is to decide to end symbiotic relationships, because it requires not only bravery to go, but also resistance to deception, guilt, and not returning. Along with anger and irritation, you also arouse desperation, and above all, guilt projection in the other person. In some relationships, all it takes to cause a serious crisis in the other person is for you to decide to stand aside and choose autonomy and silence. There was no betrayal, no screaming, and yet the other person falls apart. This exaggerated reaction has a reason, and it is emotional rather than logical. It is characterized by rage, terror, accusations, and despair, as though your absence had torn a key piece from their soul. Carl Jung tells us that in many relationships, particularly those governed by unconscious forces, you are not viewed as an individual, but rather as a projection or symbol that the other person mentally molds to fit a particular position. Within their emotional framework, you become what they require. When you leave, it's not just the relationship that falls apart. It's the illusion of the unconscious support that you represented. You are not just you were their emotional equilibrium. A mother who nurtures a father, who guards a mirror, that validates a support that keeps everything standing. According to Mary Ainsworth's research and John Bowlby's attachment theory, many people form emotional relationships characterized by a persistent dread of abandonment. People with anxious attachment live on guard because to them, stability is identical with your presence. When you break this pattern, what breaks is not the affection, but rather the structure that kept the emotional chaos contained. Margaret Mahler refers to this moment as a forced birth, because when the symbiotic bond is broken, the other person's psyche is forcibly pushed into the perception of separation of individuality, something that may have never fully developed. For those who have lived fused with the other emotionally, either symbolically or unconsciously, separation is not a farewell. Rather, it is an amputation. You did not leave just as a person, you left as a psychic function, as a mirror, support, and emotional sustenance. And that is why the other person collapses. This video will examine this phenomenon in depth with Jung, Bowlby, and Ainsworth, and the role of projections and archetypes in relationships. It will also explore the dynamics of anxious attachment and show how separation can touch on primitive childhood wounds. All of this will help you understand a difficult but necessary truth. The other person's despair is not always an indication of love. Rather, it is simply their fear of facing their own emptiness without you as a shield. If you have ever felt guilty for putting your peace of mind, or if you have ever realized that the issue was never you, but rather what you represented for the other, then this video is your mirror. In many relationships, what we call love is nothing more than an unconscious game of projections. You do not relate to the other as they truly are, but rather to the image you have created of them, and the most unsettling part is that the other does the same with you in the unconscious, shaping you into an archetypal figure. Carl Jung claimed that although we are all born originals, we die copies, not because we lose our individuality throughout life, but because we unknowingly transform into what others expect, and we expect the same from them. Jung referred to these symbolic functions as universal internal representations that exist in the collective unconscious and are projected onto common people, which you might unknowingly occupy. The human mind, especially the wounded mind, cannot withstand the chaos of emptiness, so it creates and assigns meanings, even if they are false, to maintain a sense of internal order. By entering someone's life, you can become that order. Your presence calms because it represents protection. The role of the nurturing mother, the saving father, the hero, the caregiver, the spiritual guide, or even the shadow, the one who carries what the other cannot bear to see in themselves. Your listening is validated, since it shows that you are accepted. Your silence hurts because it is interpreted as rejection of the idealized figure rather than as a gesture of yours. And herein lies the most crucial point. The more the other person distances themselves from themselves, the more they will need you to fill the void. They will put you on an invisible pedestal, not to admire you, but to use you as a foundation, and every foundation, when removed, causes the structure to collapse. Therefore, when you choose to distance yourself, what crumbles is not just the emotional bond, but also the unconscious fantasy that the other person created about you. They do not miss who you are. They miss the function you fulfilled, the emotional stability that your presence represented, and when that function disappears, despair sets in, not because they lost you, but rather because they lost the internal ground they projected onto you. This symbolic dynamic strengthens in people who have not yet faced their own shadows. Jung cautioned that individuation, or the process of becoming who you truly are, requires looking inward, integrating the shadow and abandoning projections. However, many people avoid this process because it is easier to find in the other what one does not want to face in oneself. This is where attachment psychology enters the picture, because when the symbolic projection aligns with an anxious attachment pattern, the bond becomes more than just symbolic. It is essential. The other person not only idealizes you, but also needs you to survive emotionally, and that is precisely what we will cover in the next section. What occurs if you are both anchor and archetype? If this content makes sense to you, click the subscribe button to join the channel and prepare to explore the precarious world of uneasy attachment. Thank you for your support. According to John Bowlby, the creator of attachment theory, from the earliest years of life, our brain develops relational patterns that shape how we bond with others. These patterns are not random. Rather, they arise from the repetition of emotional experiences that have left deep marks on the psyche for those who grew up with unstable bonds. When we talk about attachment, we are not just talking about affection. We are talking about emotional survival, emotional neglect, or unpredictable performance. Anxious attachment is a dynamic in which the relationship with the other person is perceived as a lifeline. Love is always accompanied with a crippling fear of abandonment. In order to justify their existence, the other person must exert self-control to relax. Their presence acts as a protective barrier against suffering, and any hint of separation, whether actual or perceived, is taken as a threat of desertion. They are clung to as an extension of their own neurological system, and the anxious person does not love lightly. This was evidently noted by Mary Ainsworth Bowlby, a colleague and pioneer in empirical studies on attachment, in her work titled The Strange Situation. This behavior does not go away with age. As they get older, anxious adults repeat the same. pattern, alternating between an intense search for closeness and an often unconscious emotional demand that the other be always available, always responsive, always present. Children with anxious attachment would go into true panic when the attachment figure left the room, even for a few minutes. They would cry, become disorganized, and then exhibit a mix of need for contact and anger when the caregiver returned. Consider what occurs if you unintentionally end up acting as this person's attachment figure and acting as an external control mechanism for their inner turmoil. This place is not one of love. Rather, it is one of entrapment, because at the slightest sign of autonomy on your part, their system goes into alarm. When you need space, they feel rejected, they hear abandonment, and when you pull away, even for personal protection, they interpret it as an attack. Your presence is what calms their chronic anxiety, and you become for them what the caregiver should have been as a child, an emotional pillar, a refuge, and an antidote against the fear of being abandoned. The other person is attempting to keep up the false impression that you were in charge of the stability they never created for themselves. Resilience to the emotional attraction of someone who will do everything it takes to restore the symbiosis. You shattered, whether on purpose or accidentally. Most individuals give up at this point. They turn around and give up their independence in order to achieve a brief peace. But in practice, this peace is fleeting, since it is based on emotional control rather than mutual respect. Carl Jung asserted that the goal of life is to become oneself, not to be nice or accepted, and that this process, which he called individualization, requires letting go of the role that other people place on you, facing your shadow, and experiencing ruptures. It is impossible to go through this process without upsetting others who have been accustomed to defining you, manipulating you, and using you as support. You weren't created to be the emotional support system for people who don't want to learn how to walk on their own. Your goal is to discover who you are beneath all the masks, roles, and expectations. For many, your autonomy is a harsh reminder that they still lack their own, but that is not your responsibility. The goal is to live your soul's truth, even if it causes you to be offended or breaks relationships. This is because partnerships that don't last aren't love. Rather, they were contracts, and contracts should be broken when they undermine your integrity. If this video made you think, or if you felt a tightness in your chest after recognizing a story that is or was yours, then write a comment that says, "I choose to be whole." Make your declaration to the part of you that still regrets leaving, not to the wider world. Although this choice can mark the start of a big shift, don't stop there. Perhaps a pivotal reflection that furthers this rupture and carries on this journey can be found in the next video. People who are awake don't go back to sleep, so keep watching.